Hello, my History 115 students. This is your Professor Donald Earl Collins. I want to talk to you a little bit about weeks 2 and 3 today. Now, I've been teaching this class in UMUC in its current format for roughly 8 years, and I've been teaching it off and on since 1994 at different places, including Carnegie Mellon, the home of world history as far as college is concerned. But anyway, and I've never really done consistent recordings, video recordings for this course, even though I've taught it probably about half the time online. Um, and so this hence the delay. I planned on putting this up yesterday in the beginning of the week, but it's the middle of the week. But it works out either way. So I'm going to go over a bit more of weeks 2 and 3. Basically an overview of what's already in the lecture notes and your quick world history notes and readings, both some of your required readings in the OERs as well as the readings that you have that I've given you as potential additional readings. The main thing I want to convey to all of you today, though, as we do weeks 2 and 3, is that if the previous times I've taught this course has been any indication, it's simply the fact lose focus after the first week of two in the course. And the reason is because despite all claims to the contrary, this is not an easy course. It's not. The fact is that most students who come into this course don't usually have enough background around global studies or global history to really know what's been going on in different parts of the world over time. And so you might know something about Stonehenge, or you might know something about Angkor Wat or Machu Picchu in Peru and South America or something along those lines. But you don't know how all those pieces fit together across time, across region and space, over the course of human history, particularly recorded or semi-recorded history, whether through oral tradition or through written documents or other sorts of ways of recovering history, archaeologically speaking or anthropologically speaking or otherwise. So just want to encourage you guys to stick with it. The fact is that don't try to memorize everything that's in the lecture notes and everything that's in the readings. That is not going to work. I don't care how smart you are not going to pick up that much world history in an 8-week course. It's just not possible. So concentrate on the things that I emphasize in the lecture notes that are extremely important, particularly around just understanding sequence of events. Even though the sequence isn't exact, it's an approximation. Trying to understand how humans went from hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists or farmers, how they domesticated animals, how that led to population growth because it gave people more time, quite frankly, to have sex and create more babies instead of having one baby every 4 years because you needed a kid to be old enough to hunt and gather before you had the next kid. You could have one every couple of years, right? Have a baby, have a little bit of time to recover, have another baby. Is typical of most women and men in terms of procreation in this way. That's how you go from 5 million people living, 4 or 5 million people on the planet roughly around 10,000 BCE to about 100 million by 3000 BCE. So just understanding that process of procreation, migrations, sedentary lifestyle, living in river valleys so that you could take advantage of glacial flooding and whatnot to grow crops, living in temperate climates around grains and the staple crops. This process possible in temperate climates all around the world. And that happened in about 7 or 8 cases all over the world, roughly between 6,000 and the growth of cities, that is, between roughly 6,000 BC and 3,000 BC, leads to the first kingdoms, the first city-states, where there are essentially kings in charge, that sort of thing. That's the process as it happens in places in Mesopotamia in the Middle East, in the Indus Valley region of Pakistan and northern India, in the Yangtze and Yellow Valley regions in China, in Egypt along the Nile River, Egypt and what is now Sudan along the Nile Valley region, right? Um, and quite frankly, it happens in other places over and over again. Just doesn't happen in this exact rough approximate time sequence. It happens later, which is what leads us to week 2. This whole thing around in the Americas and Oceania and how this process takes place in those places as well. It's a slower process. It doesn't happen between 6,000, in terms of building cities between 6,000 and 3,000 BCE, or in terms of agriculture between 10,000 BCE and 3,000 BCE overall. The process takes a bit longer in the Americas, in no small part because you basically have a group of people who've been migrating to the Americas up until the closing of the ice-land bridge across the Bering Straits between what's now Siberia and what's now Alaska around 12,000 BCE. And so those people are cut off. So it takes them a couple thousand years to colonize the continent. It takes them longer to hunt off big game, longer to figure out that they've basically made the mammoth extinct, and they've hunted horses into extinction because horses are originally from the Americas, believe it or not. And so, believe it because the evidence, the archaeological, biological, genetic, and other evidence is there, right? So, anyway, so they had to figure out ways to cultivate and domesticate crops, and they didn't really have a lot to work with. They had potatoes basically the size of small stones, and small corn the size of those little corn Chinese food. You know what the term for it, which I can't pronounce, starts with a T. But in any case, they figured out over trial and error over a couple millennia how to make those things big enough to feed large groups of people. And so as that happens in the Andes Mountains regions where there are river valleys, and high plains, and they figured this out in Central America, what's now Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras and other places. As they figured all of that out, civilizations, people build villages, turn them into small cities, and as a result, kingdoms are established, city-states become established. But that time frame in both parts of the world takes place between roughly about 5,000 BC upwards of 500 BC, right? The Olmecs don't come into play until about 1200 BC as the first major civilization in Central America. There's some evidence of the first civilizations in, or first cities in South America going back to 4000 BC, but still about 2,000 years behind what's going on in the Middle East on average. In sub-Saharan Africa, you have the same sort of conditions, the same sort of thing going on, where Bantu, which literally means the people, and all languages that we understand to be African dialects or languages pretty much in sub-Saharan Africa pretty much come from this group as they colonize sub-Saharan Africa roughly between 3000 BC up until about 1000 BC, give or take a few hundred years. And they colonize everything south of the Sahara, including South Africa. So keep in mind, people think of Africa as if it's just one country when there are 54 countries there today. But you have to understand that what we're talking about, sub-Saharan Africa, is still part of the continent. It's just cut off by the Sahara Desert for the most part. People can obviously trek across the Sahara Desert and make it to oases and more temperate or subtropical climates in northern Africa and eventually near Asia or the Middle East, but the fact is it's a dangerous journey and a lot of people aren't going to take that journey. When in point of fact, there's subtropical and tropical climates to the south that are less dangerous. So Bantu folks moved from the Niger and Congo Valley regions roughly over a 2,500 year period and settle and colonize these areas, make do there. These are people who, by the way, are agriculturalists. They know how to hunt and gather, but they are also farmers, and they know how to farm and wheat and barley and oats and all the other things that Middle Easterners would know how to farm in, except for the fact that wheat doesn't grow well in a place where there's only wet and dry season, where the average temperature is 85 degrees every single day all year long, or 80 degrees a day all year long. You need some cool periods in order for it to function well. So they adapted. They adapted to the stuff that was there. Cassava and sorghum and other things that would be staple crops for them in those parts of the world. And as a result of all of that, they're popular because they're not, they don't have enough food to grow out their numbers. It's just that simple. But they bring all the tools that allow for the rise of villages and eventually small cities, what we would call towns, right? In modern terms, 2,000 people, maybe upwards of 10,000 people. But that's pretty much how it maxes out in the center of what would now be the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Botswana, or Cameroon, or modern Nigeria, Ghana, up through up until you get to the CEs, 1 CE, 100 CE or so. And then you start seeing the development of the first kingdoms right around the second or around the 3rd or 4th century CE in places like Ghana and Mali, places that are near the Sahara, and they're able to trade with civilizations to the north, the Greco-Roman civilizations to the north, or in East Africa with the Parthian and Arab non-Muslim, because Islam doesn't exist yet, civilizations to their north as well. So there's still contact. It's just not as frequent. It's not as much. You still have population lag because, quite frankly, you don't have the massive staple crops that you can grow to feed huge numbers of people, millions of people, like you have in more temperate climates in Central South America and other parts of the world. So that's what makes sub-Saharan Africa a little different geographically and topographically and climate-wise. And then, of course, you have Oceania, which is the Pacific and Indian Ocean regions. Most of your textbooks would concentrate on the Pacific Basin and all the islands of the central and south central and southwestern Pacific Ocean as places, but those aren't the only places. Austronesians, otherwise known as Polynesians, not only settled that part of the world where the Philippines are located, where Papua New Guinea is located, where the Solomon Islands and Guam and the Marshall Islands and other places are located, but they also settled islands like Sri Lanka. They also settled islands like, if a lot later, like the Shelly's Islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean. They also eventually settled Madagascar. But you're talking about a later period that goes into about the 600 CE range. So into the 7th century of the Common Era, before these areas are pretty much settled. And they bring with them the tools of agriculture as well, the tools of domesticating small animals like pigs and goats and sheep and so on. But that process takes longer because they're crossing oceans. They're crossing major league oceans in order to get to these different places, right? And so you got to keep that in mind when these places are settled. The fact is that when you talk about humanity and advanced and non-advanced civilizations, the advances that civilizations make is because they're able to have contact with other people. It's not because one group of people is any smarter than any other group of people. It's that when you're isolated, you do what everyone else does when you're isolated. You make do. Simple as that. And so that's what these people did with agriculture, and with the agriculture that they had and with the domesticated animals they had. They could only transport so much across vast oceans. Following the stars, going from west to east, or northwest to southeast, as the case may be, to get to Philippines. And so you see more development of towns and cities closer to areas like East Asia and places like the Philippines and even Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia that lead to in those places than you would see, say, in Madagascar, or you'd see in, say, what's now Hawaii, And even in cities do develop, it takes much longer for them to develop in those places simply because they're out of contact. Their populations might grow, but they're limited by the fact that they live on islands. I mean, that goes without saying, right? And as much as you can grow different things like taro root in order to feed populations, you need a more temperate climate to grow wheat, rice, oats, etc., right? There are exceptions, of course, across all of these, and there are exceptions in terms of time as well. Austronesians do not finish settling the islands of the even in the eastern Pacific Ocean until about the 12th century CE. The last of the Maori reached New Zealand around 1100 CE. That's 650 years before James, quote unquote, discovered the Maori of New Zealand, right? So that's not that long ago in terms of human history overall. The settlement of Hawaii takes place roughly between 400 and 1000 CE. Different groups and waves come there in migration waves over a 700, 800 year period even. That's not that long ago. Madagascar between roughly 400 and 1200 CE as well. So that's relatively recent. So you're talking about a long haul to settle these islands that are extremely isolated, and they have the Great Barrier of Oceans. They might two these outrigged canoes that could sail across oceans and hold people and stuff, but they're not exactly big freight ships that can carry large numbers of people and goods across oceans, right? And you have to keep in mind, half the time they were following birds and stars to get to these places because birds obviously couldn't fly across 5,000 miles of ocean. They had to stop someplace, and so they knew that they were going to find land, just didn't know exactly where it was going to be. And so you've got low population growth and isolation in all of those cases, right? But that doesn't mean that just because these people are isolated, they have low population growth, they can't consistently practice agriculture and consistently practice animal domestication, that they had it all bad. They're just isolated in that sense. It's the civilizations that do establish themselves or are relatively more advanced have their own issues too. They can't sustain themselves. Early civilizations tend to peter out after a couple thousand years because of the fact that they slash and burn their way to basically being more and more advanced. They become more and more dependent on irrigation to feed ever larger populations, and the result usually ends up being that when a drought comes, when there's too much rain or too little rain, that they cannot handle the sudden changes in weather and the small changes in climate that might happen for 100 years or a couple hundred years. The collapse of Harappan Indian culture in the Indus Valley region, roughly between 2000 and 1500 BCE, is a classic case of slashing and burning to build large cities, cities that held as many as 250,000 people in this region. 5 million people lived in this area back in the day of northern India and southern Pakistan. And within 500 years, by the time the Aryans come, the Aryan tribes come out of Central Asia to settle their way across the Himalayan mountains, the Hindu Kush mountains, into northern India and Pakistan. The civilization's almost dead because the cities have been abandoned. They haven't been able to sustain growth of crops because they've had to deal with flooding and drought because they've chopped down so many trees that they've basically caused the banks of the Indus River to overflow, killing off, sometimes decades worth of crops, year after year after year of extended flooding that would kill crops. So that's what happened to them. Egypt, it was the opposite. Early Kingdom Egypt or Old Kingdom Egypt died out around between 2200 and 2160 BCE simply because of the fact that they had a drought that lasted for over a century. Where they couldn't grow crops either. And drought usually means famine, disease, and death for people in this era because they're not exactly able to call the UN and go, hey, we've got a famine going on, can you help us out? The nearest civilization of them in that part of the world would have been upwards of 1,200 miles away and somewhere in the middle of the Middle East. And so again, people abandon cities. This doesn't happen in China to the same extent that it happens in these other places, which is why they're one of the longest running civilizations on Earth, right? The Mayan, of course, experienced this much later because they developed much later, between the 8th and 9th century CE. So if you really, so those weeks 2 and 3, we're learning essentially about the limitations of what humanity is able to do in terms of isolation, limited technology, dealing with climate change, and man-made issues with regard to trade. All of those things are wrapped into the decline of civilizations and the limits of being able to establish full-fledged, more advanced human civilizations in other parts of the world.